thank you for agreeing to come on the show, my friends. We want to discuss a certain opinion that's been floating about on at least part of the Orthodox internet, that your Orthodox Christian Studies Center is accommodationist, quote unquote. So, this characterization has been offered for what you do at Fordham in the area of higher education and Orthodox theology. And so I'd like to talk about it. So I'd like to ask you first, George, to simply tell us, for the folks at home who might not know, what the Orthodox Christian Studies Center does, and then we'll get to the whole issue of accommodationism.
Thank you, Sister. The Orthodox Christian Studies Center facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on Orthodox Christian studies broadly understood. So a lot of what we do is theological, but we take a holistic view, and we invest in research in Orthodox history, political science, anthropology, and so forth. A lot of what we do is to fund academic conferences, research fellowships, and so forth. Probably the thing we are most known for, however, is not that kind of high-end academic work, but it is an online publication known as Public Orthodoxy, in which we invite scholars from around the world with various expertise to offer op-ed-like commentaries on a variety of issues affecting the church in the world and so forth.
I see. And both of you are Orthodox Christians.
Yes, we're both Orthodox Christians. We were both raised in the church. Telly's father was a rather famous priest in Chicago. My father-in-law was a priest for 50 years in New Jersey. So we're both graduates of the Orthodox Seminary. We are about as Orthodox as it gets.
So there are some people within the church that call me a traditionalist in that sense, because I do affirm Byzantine music and some other aspects of the church. And to allow a space, though, for discussion of certain issues that seem to be hot topics within the culture today. And I think that there are people who within the Orthodox Church that perhaps would expand this non-negotiable label, for example, or zone to some issues, to those particular kinds of issues. And that's where we theologically disagree, right? We disagree on theological grounds, not on cultural, not in any way attempt to be culturally relevant or culturally, culturally cool or culturally, trying to get some kind of cultural affirmation. We just try to, based on theological grounds that we share with others, we make an argument that there are, certain issues that are allowed to be discussed within the church and explored, and perhaps the culture itself provokes those questions. But just because the culture provokes those questions doesn't mean we're being accommodationist, because if that were the case, then all the fathers of the church would be accommodationists, because in fact, it was the pagan culture that provoked many of the questions that they had to confront. Never did the fathers say, well, that's coming from a pagan, so I don't have to deal with it. They would never, Justin Martyr, for example, never sort of encountered questions like that. The fact that we allow discussion over certain kinds of questions, and I think the heart of our perhaps difference, internal difference, and maybe that's one of the questions we can talk about too, is what is the how much difference is allowed within the church. The difference really is about what are we allowed to talk about and what are we not allowed to talk about.
Yes, deal with some of these not black and white questions, right? But I find that because of the internet age, because things that used to be only spoken about in academic settings, right? They are discussed before a broader audience. And I think that some people get scandalized. Nothing is going very wrong when we point fingers at the other side or try to damage their vocation, what they're doing, or to cast this shadow on what they're doing, or to even announce, stay away from those people. Stay away from them because they're not doing what we're doing. And we have this suspicious attitude towards their very orthodoxy, even if the people are saying, no, I believe, I believe in the creed and one God, I believe all these things. And they say, no, you don't, because you're talking about this, that, and the other thing. Why have we ceased to trust one another? And how in our very, relatively speaking, small Orthodox theological, community, how is this happening that we are engaged in some kind of culture wars against one another?
Because we are willing to host academic conferences on tough questions, and we're willing to ask things that people think we shouldn't talk about, or so forth or so on. And I've decided to speak about St. Gregory the theologian's engagement with Julian the Apostate. And I'll make this quick, but basically Julian is this mid-4th century emperor who attempts to return the empire to paganism. And he had actually been a classmate of Gregory's. And Gregory is kind of horrified by this because one of the things that Julian does is he passes an edict forbidding Christians to teach in public schools, saying that only Christians who, only people who share the religious views of pagans can teach pagan literature. And Gregory's horrified by this. And so he has this whole engagement, and he kind of shuts that down. And then years later, 30 years later, his good friend, St. Basil the Great, has died. And he goes, at the 3rd anniversary of Basil's death, he goes and gives a belated eulogy. He couldn't make the funeral originally. He was in Constantinople. And so he comes, and he's giving this eulogy for St. Basil, right? And then he has this aside at the very beginning, and he says, and I take it as a matter of fact that men of good sense understand that our greatest advantage is Hellenistic paideia, right? Meaning Hellenistic education, and meaning secular literature, right? And then he goes on to defend it, right? And to defend why it is that Christians should not only read secular literature and teach secular literature, but be engaged in the secular world, right? And then the very last line of this digression, he says, in short, we must not dishonor Hellenistic paideia because some Christians like to do so, but rather we should recognize that such men are boorish and uneducated, desiring all others to be as they themselves are, in order to hide themselves in plain sight and escape the notice that they lack all culture.
But everybody knows this. So the point I'm trying to make is that we inevitably engage the culture, and we live in this world to greater or lesser degrees, but we seem to feel that the most dangerous and contaminating people are in our own midst. And when we have voices saying things like this about other Orthodox thinkers, I'm finding that maybe we could take pause and say, maybe that's not good for us as church.
One of the really unique things about what we've created at Fordham is that, both Dr. Papanikolaou and I are now, we're senior professors. We're at Fordham forever. We are, because we're Orthodox, we don't fall under any kind of ecclesiastical supervision from Fordham. We are just our own thing. And because we are not clergymen, and because we are not at an Orthodox seminary, we have the benefits, the true benefits of what in the academy is known as academic freedom. So we are able to pursue projects and topics that the institutional church, for whatever reason, would have a greater difficulty pursuing. And I know that there are, at least on the internet, not people I've ever met, there are people who hate that we have this kind of academic freedom, or hate might be a strong word. I think they're very critical of the very kind of structure that allows this freedom. But people I have actually met, like a variety of bishops from basically every jurisdiction in the United States, have encouraged us to do this work. They support this work. They come to our events. And to quote a now retired archbishop, our job in the church is to ask the questions that others can't ask. And we just have a kind of blanket encouragement from the institution to do the kind of work that we're doing and to ask tough questions.
Right. So, yeah, you would say there are these internet voices. I
Yes.
also have to admit that I never met anybody like that. They seem to exist only online, but they say people have testified that these are real people. They have been seen by others. So I don't know.
Yes, I think that's right. And it's very easy to be frustrated with these kinds of things. My own experience, whenever I've met someone who, whenever I have actually met someone or conversed more carefully with someone who takes this kind of position, they are typically a person who is coming to this from some kind of history of spiritual or personal trauma. And they just tend to react in rather aggressive ways for a variety of reasons. And as difficult as these personalities can be sometimes, it's also, we're all part of the church, we're all part of God's creation, and to the same way that I would encourage them to be more flexible and loving and understanding, I think we have to take the same approach with them.
Oh, yeah. I have nothing against the mentally ill, George. Don't get me wrong. I will only love. There is a fetishization, is that a word? Fetishization of all things Eastern sometimes.
Yes.
By a certain type of Catholic,
Yes.
And I think it creates a false. It's one of those things, of course, that tries to help us maintain our identity. And I think that because of this globalization and because of the sort of that the boundaries are being a little bit more blurred, I think there is panic in some people who want to hold on to something, and the best they can do, or the easiest solution, is to hold on to an external thing, or to simplify, what guarantees their eliteness or their specificity
Yeah.
as
And,
church.
and I think you're exactly right. And in my experience, it's actually not people born into the church. It's people who came to it usually running away from something and thinking that they finally found what they've always been looking for, only to be to suffer cognitive dissonance because what they found isn't exactly what they thought it was.
Yes, people will often say, if you touch upon issues that have sort of been addressed already decades ago in those other communities, right? And people have fled to Orthodoxy to escape perhaps those issues. That's true. Very often I will be told, oh, you don't know what that leads to because we've been through that. back in whatever church they were in, and we know what that leads to, and that's like, well,
That's like error 101 in logic. That's not the way logic works.
right, right. No, but it also shows that well, if you believe that you have now entered the true church, if you
Yes.
believe that, then why would you think that this is the same thing
Yeah.
in the church? It's
Right.
not the same thing, because here is a safe haven. It's the church, and the Holy Spirit guides the church, right? Or or is the church sort of this finished product, right?
Right.
That
Do you
that's
have so little faith in the church you've joined?
right, right. So yeah, anyway, what to do, because the canonical legislation was not meant to stop in the church.
Right.
There was no council said let there be no more creativity in legislation after the late ninth century, when the canonical codex is totally complete, and we'll have books like the Rudder that will pronounce the holy canons as second only to scripture. Um, they weren't meant to cease to be replaced by other canons as they were in the first millennium. But it seems, like you said, the existence of those canons would be impossible were not there an emperor to force everybody to get together, as he did.
Right.
So how can we produce equally weighty canonical legislation that does presume today's world, when and we've painted ourselves into a corner sometimes by saying, instead of saying, oh, this is what's happened, we have to learn maybe to recognize why we're in this what do you call it in English, sort of a rut.
Yeah.
The church can't create anew what the church has to create anew, things like just disciplinary questions,
Sure.
even these questions about gender and sort of sexual issues, and of sexual, I don't know, morality, in the light of just a changed kind of a lot of changed things, and technologies, and birth control, and I don't know, there's a lot of things that require a certain kind of you know a look at, but there's no emperor, right? So what would you uh, suggest, say, to it's interesting how you said you don't lament that now there's this freedom. um it's perhaps good that nobody has to be forced to come anywhere, but my question was, how do we get ourselves out of the impasse?
Yeah. So if I can only propose step one, because you have to have step one to get to step two, and
No,
I think,
first you have to admit you have a problem.
well, that's it. Step one is to acknowledge the historical reality. Yeah, I even kind of provocatively tweeted out a series of questions a few months ago about, one of the things the canons do have a lot of restrictions about are clerics preaching outside of their jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So what do you do with the internet vigilante priest, right, who goes into everyone else's jurisdiction and critiques what they're doing, right? Don't the canons prohibit precisely that kind of behavior?
Yes, but they don't prohibit it to women, so
Or lay academics.
as long as they don't speak in church, but online, please.
And also, I mean, as a lay theologian teaching at a Catholic university, I think I have also a certain amount of flexibility to address topics and issues and examine certain questions that confront the church.
You have a certain what? Flexibility, you said? Or did you say
Yeah.
freedom? You didn't say freedom.
Yeah, freedom.
No?
But freedom and flexibility.
You mean flexibility in the sense of time management? Or do you mean something else?
Yeah, I think that there's a certain amount where...
We're the topic is truth-telling.
Right,
Professor.
truth-telling. Yeah, I think that it does allow me a certain. I do think that there are certain topics that are difficult within the institutional church setting, whether it's a parish or whether it's at the seminary, to be brought up and to be discussed. And I think that one of the reasons why we started our center, our Orthodox Christian Studies Center, was to provide a space, perhaps, for there to be kind of free discussion, free flow of thought on practically any topic. Not any topic, because we do have our we do draw the line at certain places, and so we won't. Our center is really not going to have a conference debating the divinity of Christ. That's part of the dogmatic tradition. That's non-negotiable. But we also feel that the dogmas of the church, which, if you really think about it, are really just few. They're not really. It's not really a big book of dogmas. They're all centered around the person of Christ, who Jesus is, and they really set the parameters for discussion and debate. They don't really stifle it. They're trying to set the ground rules.
Right.
So from that point of view, we try to work with them. We try to think and work and live within that dogmatic tradition, and we try to confront challenges and questions, and we don't necessarily set a limit on the kinds of things that people want to talk about through the various venues of our center.
I find it particularly interesting, the restrictions on discussion, not specifically coming from our church culture, which I don't think is actually inherent to Orthodox church culture. Certainly our patristic tradition is all about discussion, all about diving into also polemics and having serious arguments also about dogmatic issues.
Right.
So, but I do think that increasingly our internet culture, our political climate, has everybody quite afraid of saying anything.
Right.
And those of us that engage in some level of public speaking might feel quite paralyzed to discuss anything slightly controversial even,
Right.
because a misstep in this or that direction, because, say, somebody that does have an academic mind might be interested in talking about those gray zones. It's the problematic things, not the things that nobody needs to discuss, that we discuss.
For the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, we, through just simply our activities, we try to make a statement that there are things that we can and should talk about. Now, there are people who disagree with that, but that's the point. In other words, we're making a particular statement. We feel that we have good theological reasons for why we can foster these kinds of discussions through various venues. We have a blog called Public Orthodoxy. We have conferences. We have publications. We do public speaking through our teaching, through our doctoral students, through so many kinds of things. And there are those who feel that certain ways in which we think about these kinds of questions, and they're theological, they're social, they're moral. They're not just a few questions. So there are people who feel that orthodoxy is defined by a kind of a certain settling of questions, and our worship then allows us then to, or challenges us then, to figure out how we should actually engage in these inevitable discussions, these inevitable questions, these inevitable kinds of challenges in ways that mirror what we're trying to live in and through the Eucharist. One of the things I've noticed is that certain kinds of truth-telling are transformative. Transformative in such a way that we can notice ourselves being a little less angry, a little less hateful, a little less fearful. The three vices that Maximus says really get in the way of love.
Insofar as it is a space that is not the church, the political space is one that is defined by pluralism of beliefs and moralities. Engaged in practices of divine human communion, Christians would be actively engaged in a Chalcedonian politics that does not see this pluralism as a threat.
They would instead attempt to shape this pluralism through a minimal set of underdetermined normative principles that include freedom and equality, guaranteed through human rights language that is not linked to a specific religious morality, all the while being aware that the ecclesial is not the political, even if, as I would argue, that the mystical is the political. Along these lines, I would like to propose, in a way that I have not really done in any previous writing, that the Orthodox globally shift their rhetoric in relation to the political space. Rather than focusing on the diametrical opposition between the godless secular liberals and the defenders of traditional values, rather than focus on specific moral issues, the Orthodox should shift their rhetoric to articulating a fuller vision of the human as the human could be. The Orthodox should not align themselves with evangelical Christians in projecting a Christianity that is simply anti-gay and anti-abortion, especially since evangelical Christians cannot conceive of a Christian existence in terms of divine human communion. Another way to put this is that evangelical Christianity can only project a Christianity in the public space that focuses on moral principles because it is Nestorian at its core, stuck in a dualist conception of the God-world relation. In a Chalcedonian non-dualist affirmation of the God-world relation, the Orthodox can assess the political space not in terms of the legalization of particular moral principles, but in terms of how political space iconically reflects a vision of divine human communion. And the measure of such an assessment are the types of relationships enabled by a political space. The Orthodox should stop talking about the so-called post-secular, because theologically there is no such thing as a post-secular. Long before the Enlightenment, Christianity has always confronted the secular in the eschatological sense as the time and space before the fullness. There is and always shall be a secular, but the Orthodox should start speaking of the secular in terms of radical pluralism, as is being done now by Charles Taylor, Atalia Omer, and other political theorists. If understood the secular in terms of radical pluralism, then the real target is not the secular per se, but the hyper-individualism that ironically threatens radical pluralism by enabling enclave-like us versus them relationships. The Orthodox should stop opposing those who support so-called traditional values against the godless liberal secularists and focus their efforts on shaping the political space so as to foster particular kinds of relationships in a space constituted by radically pluralistic beliefs and moralities. These relationships ultimately must be realized through particular civic virtues. In light of this, the real target for Orthodox political rhetoric should not be certain moral issues, such as abortion or gay marriage, but hyper-individualism. It has been argued that hyper-individualism is a product of modern political discourse, but as the debates between liberalism versus communitarianism make clear, it is not inherent to political liberalism. It may be the case that the kind of hyper-individualism that one witnesses in the West is a product of unregulated capitalism more than liberal democracy. And I think that rather than take aim at specific moral issues, the Orthodox rhetoric should take aim at the idea that the self can ever be buffered. In other words, it should critique the imagined notion of the buffered self, and the hyper-individualism grounded in such a self as itself an illusion. The Times Square experience, I think, indicates that hyper-individualism and the buffered self is fueled not so much by the anthropological presuppositions of liberal democracy per se, but by capitalism that is not motivated by the common good. In its critique of the hyper-individualism enabled by the illusory sense of the self as buffer, the Orthodox would find common cause with many other religious traditions, as well as some specialists within the social sciences and the humanities, toward an understanding of the self as always and forever porous, even in the immanent frame that is the political space. In doing so, you could open up the possibility of a relational self, and to a vision of the flourishing of the self in forms of relationships that are realized through the virtues. Rather than emphasizing the vague notion of values or morality, it could point to the value of virtue-enabled forms of relationships. You can imagine the secular as a space for realizing forms of virtue-enabled relationality among peoples with diverse ultimate commitments, even as it works toward an overlapping consensus on those values. You could imagine as supporting the political legalization of gay unions as a way of affirming that committed long-term relationships that even involve sex, no matter who the persons are, manifest the very virtues that St. Maximus identifies with the presence of God, and thus stop the very cruel and untheosis-like, and in that sense heretical, identification of being gay with prostitution, perversity, and pedophilia, which is fueled by a Nestorian logic. He might even be motivated to speak out against the violence perpetrated against gay people, even by its own clergy. The secular space, as the maximization of pluralism, as Taylor understands it, is not that of godless, anti-religion, hedonistic liberalism. Quite the contrary, it is a political space that iconically reflects the virtues manifested in divine human communion. It is a form of divine human communion, even if not in its fullness.